Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of Future Cities. I'm Steve Nelser. In 2020, issues of systemic racism and racial justice rightfully rose to the forefront of many people's minds. These issues are relevant in all aspects of society, including academia and STEM fields. In solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and inspired by other efforts that we've seen on social media to elevate Black voices in STEM, we wanted to use our platform on this podcast to amplify the voices of Black scientists working in the field of urban resilience. So, for Black History Month, February, we will be publishing one episode every week featuring a conversation with a different Black scientist in our field. We've never published so many episodes in such a short period of time and plan to go back to just publishing 1 or 2 episodes a month after this, but our team felt that this was important and were willing to put in the extra work to get these conversations to you. So big thanks to Yoan Kim, Robert Lloyd, and Marissa Matzler for taking the lead on these special episodes. This week's episode is the second in our Black History Month series, so remember to go back and listen to the first one if you missed it. Okay, here's the episode.
Hey everybody, this is Robert Lloyd with you again on the Future Cities podcast, and we are really privileged to have with us for this installment in our Black History Month series, Dr. Prentiss Dantzler of Georgia State University's Urban Studies Institute, where I am currently a PhD student. So, Dr. Dantzler, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we are so lucky to have you. Thank you for making time for us. So, why don't we start by you telling us about the work that you do at the Urban Studies Institute, your current research, your teaching load, if that's appropriate for this semester?
Sure. So my work particularly focuses on housing issues, or more so housing insecurity, and social welfare policy. And within a lot of that, I tend to look at how neighborhoods are changing and how households are reacting to those changes. So most of my work has been focused on public housing, but I've kind of broadened that out to think of other aspects of housing insecurity, whether people are receiving some type of public assistance and those who are not. Another layer I really look at in my research is neighborhood satisfaction. So even in the neighborhoods that people are situated, do they even like where they live? And a lot of the reasons why I kind of focus on that is that a lot of the policy arguments in this space tend to characterize neighborhoods as disadvantaged or having low opportunity. But for many people living in these spaces, these are the best places they want to live, and these are the neighborhoods that they want to call home indefinitely. So I look at the push and pull factors of neighborhood change, particularly among low-income communities of color. Since being at the Urban Studies Institute, I've kind of broadened my reach. So I look a lot more now at transportation policy and transportation costs as the second biggest cost that households are dealing with. And even more recently, I've worked with a couple colleagues in other institutions around energy costs and energy efficiency as well. So I've kind of taken my housing focus and broadened it out to think about affordability across different venues and avenues. So I joined the faculty here at Georgia State in fall of 2019. And currently I am teaching a local governance class for the Public Management and Policy Department at the undergraduate level and a global urban trajectories class at the master's level for our MIS program. But I also have PhD students in that as well. So it's been a kind of good experience to deal with both of these classes at the undergrad and graduate level, and really helpful and useful for like the students at GSU.
That's great. Thank you. And of course, this is kind of an introduction for each of us to each other as well, because we had met briefly when you came onto campus for the first time. But shortly after that, the campus was locked down for the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, an event which, as we record this in late January 2021, is still going on. So we have missed out on a lot of those casual interactions that a professor and a student will have on campus in the department.
I agree. I mean, part of the interest that coming to Georgia State is given a lot of kind of urbanists in the department, whether it's faculty or students, but even across the institution. And I moved down in December of 2019, and then a few months later, COVID hit. So it was a quick adjustment that we all had to make. And I would argue that a lot of times in these spaces, the one thing that I miss is that community building that we usually have within departments, especially here at JSU since we're a smaller program. But we're hopeful, that things will get back to some state of normality in the near future.
Absolutely. And of course, given your field of study, Atlanta is sort of a hot site of research because of the economic and social changes that are going on here that have been going on for, at least 25 years now, I think. Is that what drew you here? Where did you come to Atlanta from?
Yeah, so previously I was an assistant professor of sociology at Colorado College. I'm out in Colorado Springs, but I lived in Denver. So I'm an urbanist and I really enjoy big cities. I'm originally from Philadelphia, so I'm really enjoying the kind of density, the kind of urban life, the vibrancy of kind of these urban spaces. Atlanta was on my focus given I was moving through the kind of tenure track spaces. I started to think about cities that I actually wanted to be in long term. Denver didn't feel like that place. I had a great faculty and department there. I had a lot of colleagues that were doing interesting work, but it never felt like home. It felt like a temporary stop to really kind of gain knowledge and grow my professional career. And when I came to Atlanta, that seemed to be different. This is a place where I have a lot of friends outside the academy living in Atlanta, have been living here for some years. And given all the housing issues around neighborhood change, gentrification, being a majority Black city, it really drew me here to really think about my work, but how does it situate in the South, but particularly in the Atlanta region.
Sure, excellent. So what got you into urban studies in the first place?
Yeah, so I went to Rutgers and got my PhD in public affairs with a focus on community development. I studied under Paul Dragowski, my advisor, who was all around concentration of poverty and neighborhood change and neighborhood dynamics, and doing even more recent work on segregation and the architecture of segregation. But growing up in Philly, it's been typically or historically a more lower income, middle income city. Until recently, I would say in the last kind of 25, 30 years, you see this kind of vibrant change. So while a lot of cities were not constructing new buildings or not doing development, Philly was one of the few places that were continuing their construction patterns. So a lot of new businesses moving in the city, and a lot of anchor institutions from all the universities and hospitals there as well. So when I came home from undergrad, my dad had a mortgage that he got back in 2006. And like a lot of us know about the Great Recession, there was a lot of subprime lending at that time. So these are when teaser rates are giving out to a lot of households, maybe 1 to 2 to 3%. And after a couple of years, they jumped. So my dad had a duplex in Southwest Philly. And then I moved into one of the units. And when I got some of the mail, I was wondering, like, Dad, why is your mortgage like almost $1,200 a month? That doesn't make sense. The value of this house is not worth that much. And then when I got in a little bit more digging around it and realizing, oh, you have like a 9% interest rate. That's not normal for a mortgage. So I really kind of took my attention. I used to be really into kind of environmental studies, but I took my attention and moved more to kind of housing studies and housing policy. So I feel like I'm slowly getting back to the environmental through the energy work that we're doing now.
Sure.
But I do think that it was like a personal thing for me. My family was one of the people that a lot of housing scholars talk about in the literature with predatory lending. And that kind of pushed me to go in this space to really investigate the contours of why these things are happening.
Yeah, okay, really interesting. So really your interest in and involvement with, even beyond urban studies, sort of community affairs, the processes of how people come together as community or are split apart by community, processes of governance, things like that. You really go way back with that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think part of it is that thinking about a lot of the neighborhoods that we talk about in the literature are spaces where people don't feel like have any agency or power in recreating those spaces for themselves. Mm-hmm. And given the history of neglect, a lot of communities feel like the role of the government is to kind of reinforce these spatial struggles that they're suffering versus seeing them as aid. But there is a governance issue there, right? As we've seen in recent elections, right? Depending on who's in power, depending on who's the policymaker, that drastically changes the contours of how we're making neighborhoods and making communities. So part of my work, I hopefully think, addresses some of those issues. but also gives some type of story to people where the neighborhoods that we typically don't think have opportunity have a lot of opportunity, but we're just seeing them from an academic lens in a problematic way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping that my research kind of speaks to that.
Yeah, terrific. And you made mention of your energy work. What are you doing on the energy side of things?
Yeah, so I'm working with a group right now. I'm working with a group called ComEd, and they're under Exelon Company. A bunch of researchers are over there looking at thinking about gentrification from the energy piece. So even as a lot of people are sheltering in place, this is increasing utility costs for households. And part of what we're doing, or we pitched a proposal to NSF, is to study how can we think about distributive energy resources at the local level to secure or to mitigate some of these utility costs, these rises in utility costs. The project, or the pilot project that we pitched, is focused on a couple of neighborhoods in Chicago. A lot of my kind of collaborators are based out there, but we're also working like with an engineering faculty at the University of Denver. So thinking about the social, but also the technical components about securing or reducing energy burdens at the local level. And then I've been communication with Dr. Tony Reams at University of Michigan to really think about how there's this kind of energy disparities that happen. I would say a lot of ways in which we even think about housing costs tends to only focus on rents or mortgages, but there are these other housing costs that we normally don't talk about. So we've been thinking about adding that into the literature to say, hey, when we think about housing insecurity, it's not just about what you pay for rent or what you pay for a mortgage. There's all the other associated costs of living in a particular place that we need to keep in mind.
Absolutely, yeah. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as energy goes, I feel like we're in kind of an interesting time, an interesting inflection point for energy.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we've just had a change of presidential administration. There is the hope among a lot of us that it will result in some kind of progress, some kind of move forward as far as more sustainable energy generation goes. But as you alluded to, the social aspect of energy generation and distribution is very important too, and maybe often overlooked in the discourse about energy. That maybe tends to focus more on things like greenhouse gas emissions, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of us are hopeful that there will be some kind of massive infrastructure bill. And a lot of that bill that we're seeing right now has dedicated money for affordable housing, environmental policy, but also addressing climate change, and also issues around labor unions and rights within that as well. And there's another piece in terms of transportation. So I would argue that a lot of times we treat these things in isolation, where we got to think about how they're connected to each other, right? Like you can't build a massive affordable housing program without also thinking about education, without also thinking about transportation. And part of the issue in terms of federal policy, at least, but even down to local policy, is that a lot of times when we treat these things in isolation, we forget or we undercut the very same policies that we're implementing. So part of the kind of vibrancy and the eagerness and the optimism is that with a more kind of progressive democratic administration, we can push for some of these changes that we see at the local level, and also understand that they don't just affect cities, they also affect rural communities as well.
Sure, absolutely. We, a lot of us have made the point in the Urban Studies Institute or in the urban studies field in general that the rural flip side of that, or maybe not even a flip side, an extension oftentimes, is too easy to overlook.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I mean, part of the issue is that we've been so focused on a local level without thinking regionally in some of these processes or these policies that we should be designing and implementing. But the other piece is when we look at even the state of housing costs, a lot of rural communities have higher levels of housing insecurity than even some of the cities, right? So you have a double disadvantage of not having a great amount of housing supply, but also stagnant wages within these smaller local economies.
Yes.
So part of the reason why we need to make sure that we're not just addressing issues of urbanizing cities, the rural communities themselves are having these issues as well. So we need to think about strategically how to link these two together to get more kind of effective and efficient policies and practices.
Yeah, and of course, this is arguably even more applicable for a city like Atlanta, which has so much urban sprawl going on. The Atlanta metropolitan area is massive compared to the size of the city itself.
That's part of the issue that we see in terms of that is like the spatial geography or the kind of sprawled out nature, as you mentioned, contributes, right, or exacerbates some of these issues when you're trying to think about what's an efficient transportation system look like, or where do you actually build more affordable housing and still have access to some of the local economies or local centers, business centers, or economic centers that a lot of people work at. And I think that's a challenge for a lot of sprawled out spaces to really contend with going forward.
Now, I think it's still fair to call you a newcomer to Atlanta. I'm a relative newcomer. We moved here, almost 8 years ago, and I'm still getting to know the place. So I'm curious, how much did you know about Atlanta history, Atlanta society and culture, and the different sort of social phenomena going on here before you came in? And then what have you observed since you came in? For instance, what's been a surprise to you about coming to Atlanta, maybe?
Yeah, I would say, so I've visited Atlanta over the years since I was younger, coming down here for like weekend trips with friends or a few academic conferences here and there. And yeah, I definitely still feel like a newcomer. I would never claim to be, embedded with Atlanta, at least until like a few years from now, at least trying to get my bearings. I still use GPS everywhere I go. So I definitely don't feel like a local. But part of the kind of the ways in which I think about Atlanta have been particularly in the literature around housing, right? So as a space that had some of the first public housing sites in the 1930s, had Black mayoralship over the years, a thriving Black community, has the kind of a moniker being known as the Black Mecca. I was really interested in coming to this place to really think about what that really means, right? Especially as a Black scholar, really kind of thinking about in these spaces when we have these kind of histories of cultural institutions and activism and progressive change, what does that really look like in the city? I think since I've been here, I've kind of understood that there are different players that I didn't know before, right? So we understand that the business community definitely has a big stronghold on the development of the city. We understand the utility community definitely has a stronghold on the city. But also just like the differences in local politics, given the neighborhood planning units that Atlanta has, which are very unique, giving the different kind of histories of neighborhoods and even the gentrification. I didn't realize how big it was really going in the city. When I first moved here, I was like, all right, I need to buy a condo or buy a house because the rents out here are very high and they're similar to other cities, right? But historically, Atlanta has been this place where it's a little bit more cost effective and we don't see that like we used to, particularly in the city limits. So I've been very interested and very surprised on how much gentrification is actually happening in the city, or even just like where people decide to live is like they do live in the Atlanta region, but they don't live in the city of Atlanta. So it's been a kind of good juxtaposition to think about when people call a place home, what does that really mean? And even the contours of their daily lives, like driving, 30, 45 minutes in traffic and all that type of stuff. I think that's kind of re-articulated or reimagined a different vision of Atlanta before I got here. And also giving me some different perspectives to think about in the ways in which cities ebb and flow.
That's great. Well, I guess COVID-19 has kind of shot this in the foot, but are there any particular challenges you found working in Atlanta or getting to know Atlanta outside of that?
Yeah, I mean,
you already mentioned some, I think.
Yeah, I think part of it is the isolation, right? So like I came down here by myself. I have friends that I've known for years, but it's still, we're trying to be responsible and not go outside as much or kind of mingle or socialize in public settings. So it's really been a kind of very much reduced amount of interaction with just other people.
Yeah.
Part of the other piece is that, any new position, you're trying to learn the local environment. What is our department doing? Where are we going? And that's been very interesting to think about among a different amount of people. Like this is what the spaces that we're actually engaged in. I think lastly, I would say it's just the learning curve, right? I'm trying to give myself some grace, but I want to learn more just about how the city works. Who are the power players? What are the local community organizations fighting for different changes in different sectors or policy areas? And that's been a little kind of frustrating, but also a little daunting, just because we just can't readily walk up and have a meeting with the organization. And at this point, I feel like we're all getting zoomed out about like really just meeting with each other. So that's been a challenge. I mean, I am hopeful that that changes in the near future, but you just never know. I think we're all adjusting to the pandemic, and that's putting some more people at odds, or even just thinking about where they want to go or do the type of work that they do.
Sure. Going back to the political side of things, of course, we were recently witness to massive political change in the state of Georgia. It flipped blue for the presidential election. It flipped blue for the Senate runoff elections, which is unprecedented, really. However, Atlanta, though it wasn't alone, it really was a statewide effort. Atlanta was certainly the seat of that. And really, it's been the seat of political change going back, 60 or 70 years now, if not longer.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, part of the piece that people were saying in terms of our counties is that some of these surrounding counties are voting more blue than they historically have. But I also would argue that that's a function of just where people are living compared to historically, right? So when there were kind of segregated, clustered communities of color, that presented or kind of contained the political activism or political concentration, where one of my colleagues, Akira Drake Rodriguez, calls like these Black participatory geographies. And while she focuses on public housing, I think that space has expanded more into suburban or surrounding counties now than historically has been. So part of the kind of nature of Atlanta changing, or the counties around even Atlanta Metro and even in other places around the state, I think that's going to be an ongoing thing. But it is, I would argue, a function of the suburbanization of different communities that historically haven't been in these places. So I would say that politically, the politics surrounding the changes in Atlanta will be reflected in leadership and political people who are holding political offices. But that also means that we have a lot more work to do to curb some of these security issues or affordability issues within our region, but even in different spaces across the state.
Yeah, very interesting. So, this is the Future Cities podcast.
Right.
And we always like to talk about, even when it's not the explicit focus of a given installment, we like to talk about city futures. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about your take on the future of cities in general, future of cities in the U.S., and maybe particularly, if you want to go there, the future of the city of Atlanta. What do you see as some things that are likely to change, maybe have to change, even that you would like to see change in cities in the future? Say by the year 2080, to throw out a nice round date that we like to use for the questions like this.
Okay. All right. So like 60 years, almost 60 years from now.
Yeah.
A lot of the literature and a lot of the kind of the discussion around cities have been these places where most people are moving to, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that begs the question of who's moving there and why are they actually moving there going forward. A lot of the housing insecurity issues or the affordability issues, I think, will be exacerbated in the coming years. And unless there's like some monumental change in policy or investments to secure people in their rights to homes, I think what we know is these urban centers will likely expand much larger than the city limits, but even much larger than the few counties surrounding even that central city. And I see that happening in Atlanta, right? I think a lot of the investment in terms of market rate rentals and housing, new housing, doesn't address or misses the middle, right? I think it misses a lot of people who can't afford to pay $1,500, $1,600 a month on rent.
Yeah.
So the city, I would say, would be more this moniker, this site for people who can actually afford to stay there. And I would, if I had to be more optimistic, I would say that it doesn't have to be that. I think a lot of times when we think about where people are moving and why they're moving there and where they're getting access to, that rearticulates or redesign where people have access to amenities and resources, right? So if we think about the mobility literature that says, people need to move to these communities and these counties and these neighborhoods that have higher resources or amenities for them so they can have more economic mobility. There's an underlying problem with that, I think. I think that accepts the fault that neighborhoods even in the kind of more distressed or neglected communities, won't see any additional progress. And I think that's part of the problem when we think about what the future will look like in terms of a lot of these places, if we're not dealing with that. And I having spent some time in other spaces like even Toronto more recently, I see that then when you have a different political and policy context, regardless of the status of the neighborhood, people still have advantages or still can be economically mobile. And I would hope that in the next 60 years, there's some kind of reckoning with that as we see it down here, and not just accept the fact that certain cities will always be neglected or certain cities will always have some level of disadvantage, and really kind of re-articulate or redesign spaces by which people can have access to resources. I would like to see a kind of stronger state involvement in what's really happening, a lot more investment. Even in the times of the pandemic, we see a lot of austerity measures taken by institutions, organizations, and states. But that doesn't really invest in the human capital that you have locally and regionally within these boundaries. So my hope going forward is that we'll re-articulate a city that's actually accessible, but also a residential landscape that's stable for all households and not just the ones that can afford to live in these places.
Yeah. That's terrific. Super. How about the near future? Of course, we are still embroiled in the pandemic.
Yes.
We have a new administration, new senators coming in at the federal level, of course, but it's still very early in that development. And there's still enormous political and cultural division in the U.S. But our work keeps rolling on. So what have you got coming up in 2021? Still a new year as we record this that you would like to talk about.
Yeah, I think the few things that I am thinking about professionally, I've kind of been more embedded within some of the community organizations or local institutions around housing issues. So right now I'm working with Mercy Housing Southeast, and we're developing a housing toolkit for local strategies across the Atlanta region to promote racial equity. And a lot of that tends to deal with issues of zoning, but also access to financial capital. I'm also trying to figure out a way to work. The other piece that I normally don't do in my work is homelessness. And that tends to be like an extreme end to the housing policy or the housing studies. But I'm curious to see like thinking about this spectrum of housing tenures, whether it's people who are experiencing homelessness all the way up to homeowners, and kind of thinking more holistically about what that means. So I'm trying to cultivate new relationships with different organizations that deal with homelessness in different frames. And we're starting that process. I would also say that I'm just trying to, at this point, work with collaborators that are doing interesting work. I think I'm at the point in my career where I have a strong network of people who I'm still in a constant state of learning, but they really are driving my intellectual curiosity in different ways, even within our own department. Like my colleague David Iwaniak, he's like willingly pulled me into a project thinking about sustainable futures, but also sustainable networks and regional networks. And that's been useful to think about issues of equity and what does that really mean in those spaces. Working with my colleague Jean-Paul Addy, who's a phenomenal critical theorist, but even I've been doing some more kind of theoretical work and even getting some insights from him, given his impressive background, but his just key insights and his brain. I really enjoy the way he thinks. And then just working with a number of other people at the institution and even at other institutions, like the micromobility lab that we have here, been working with a group here, just to kind of promote and thinking about what a sustainable public transportation system actually looks like across the region. So I think I would argue for me, this year is still a state of learning, and really a state of just exploring different avenues, but also bringing them back to see how to connect to my own work. And kind of being exposed to these new avenues allows me to think broader about solutions and policies and practices that we could do here locally, regionally, at the state level, but also even at the federal level. So that's what I'm using this year to do, is just to kind of use it as a year of consumption, if you will.
Sure, yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah.
That's great. One more future question.
Sure.
Young people, or at least people maybe planning on making a career switch, who are thinking of going into urban studies or a related field. I wonder what advice, encouragement, ideas, inspiration you might have for someone in that kind of position.
Sure. So the beauty, I was literally just talking to my graduate class about this earlier this week. The beauty of urban studies is that, you're a jack of all trades, right? You pull in different theoretical perspectives, you pull in different methodological approaches, but you think bigger about some of the issues that I would say a lot of the other disciplines don't. I think we're conditioned to think a certain way when you're in like a sociology program or a political science program or economics program. And we need to think more broader about how these things are interrelated. And we shouldn't just rely on what our fields are telling us as canonical thought or the way to think about something. If anything, I will hope that all my students have an intellectual curiosity about the way the world works. And urban studies provides that. It provides you with different vantage points to look at the same particular issue. So while I might look at housing in one way, my colleague Dan McGluck may look at it a different way, or my colleague Fei Lee may look at it a different way. And that's been really useful to also mitigate some of the issues where you're having these blinders on about why people are experiencing some of the issues in their houses or their homes or their communities. In terms of the job market, I think you have to have transferable skills. And I would argue that urban studies provides that. A lot of the ways in which we even instruct our students, from the theoretical foundations or the interdisciplinarity of the program, but also even method skills with GIS and stats and even qualitative work. I think that these things fit in a nice kind of narrative together to really think about what do you bring to the table that somebody else doesn't. And I would argue that a lot of urban studies can do that. And it also, like, I was at the point in my career where I chose to come to Georgia State. I was already in a faculty position somewhere else, but I just really appreciate the interdisciplinary nature of it. When I was doing my graduate work at Rutgers University Camden, this was part of that environment. It was an interdisciplinary group of faculty that came to the same type of issues came to the same type of issues from different vantage points. And I think that strongly built how I approach looking at issues that I don't even know, right? And something that lastly I would say, a lot of times I think we rely on people telling students particularly what to know or what to think. And for me, it's like, no, you should teach them to be critical and how to think about these things. Because there are things in the future that we haven't imagined happening, right? We haven't imagined a pandemic hitting in 2021 and what that really meant for local businesses, what that really meant for housing insecurity, what that meant for state budgets. But part of it is that you should have a critical lens to that, to think about, what do I know based on the histories of some of these issues? But what are those kind of imaginaries that we can put out there to think about how we can push back forward to a just future? And I would argue that urban studies allows you to do that more so than a lot of other disciplines.
That's terrific. Thank you. So you had a really nice interaction with a new student coming into class the other day that you talked a little about on social media. Are you willing to share that with us?
Sure. Yeah. So it was in my undergraduate local governance class. And part of the reason I do love Georgia State is that we have a very diverse student body, right? And you don't get that at many institutions. It's a minority serving institution. It's a predominantly Black institution. And one of my younger Black women students in a class, like when we logged on, you're still getting used to first class. And I could see her mouthing to her mom, like, "Mom, he's a Black professor, like he's Black." So then the mother walked behind the screen, stopped, looked at the screen for a little bit, and then walked past. And you could see them mouthing back to each other about that. And I really enjoyed that. I think part of the being in these spaces, and particularly being Black faculty, is it could be very isolating, right? So I'm the only Black scholar in my department. There are not that many Black scholars even here at GSU compared to the other kind of racial and ethnic groups here, which is daunting given that the city is based in Atlanta, right? And given that, in terms of the academy, you don't get that much choice on where you could go. So a lot of people will only look at these big cities to really live out their careers. So for me, it was another example that representation really matters in the classroom as well. And it goes down from the things that we teach our students to the personalities they connect with, but also the professors that they actually serve under or have as advisors or push them into different directions. And And as being like a first generation college student, being from a lot of the places that we look into the literature as places of disadvantage, it really meant a lot to me to think about my trajectory in this space, to think about where I've come thus far, but also the possibilities for a lot of the students I mentor, even here at Georgia State, but even I still mentor a lot of students at Colorado College, or even at Rutgers when I was teaching classes there. So a lot of it is to think about how can we create pipelines and opportunities for people who never fathomed to be in these positions. And that was just a unique situation in which it was very kind of enlightening, but also inspiring to think about we all have a role to play in this space.
That's super terrific. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
No problem.
So we're about at that time. I have to let you go. Is there anything else you wanted to make sure that we talked about today?
No, I mean, I would argue that in the issues of a just future are very kind of at the nexus of how we think about inequality as well, right? Like that justice, what does that really mean in these spaces? Because we can keep doing the same things we've always been doing. We can keep alleviating some policies and problems that we see at the local level or even state levels or federal levels. But that justice piece is something I would strongly urge all of us to really think about. What does that really mean in the context of our different spaces? And if we're working in, building consensus and our eyes are to that as a goal, but an ongoing process, I would hope that we will get to the just futures that we largely talk about.
That's great. All right, Professor Prentiss Dantzler, where may people find you if they wish to find you?
Sure. So you can follow me on Twitter at Doc Dantzler. I have my own webpage, www.drdantzler.com, and always kind of browse the Urban Studies Institute here locally, and you can see my profile and my work as well. So doing a lot of speaking engagements more so now. I'm speaking at the Atlanta Regional Housing Forum in a couple of weeks, talking about the program that we're doing with Mercy Housing or the toolkit that we're developing. But yeah, Twitter is probably the best place to find me. And if not, just shoot me an email.
All right. Dr. Dantzler, thank you so much for making time for us on the Future Cities podcast. It's been great hearing about your work and getting to know you a little better.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me and sharing this space with me and the opportunity to talk to you and your viewers. And I look forward to seeing where the podcast keeps going.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one.
The Future Cities podcast is an outreach effort brought to you by the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or UREX as we usually refer to it. To learn more about UREX, visit www.sustainability.asu.edu/urban resilience. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at FutureCitiesPod. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.